is about experience paper. It is a Haskell in computational biology.
The other way around.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Hello?
Yeah.
On the switch on the top. On top of it, there's a mute button.
Testing? Okay, great. Thank you. Welcome. My name is Noah Daniels, and this is an experience report on using Haskell in computational biology. This is joint work with Andrew Gallant and Norman Ramsey, who are both here, so please feel free to approach them later. So, an experience report is supposed to provide evidence that functional programming really works, and also discuss obstacles that keep it from working. So I'd like to happily tell you in Act 1 that it really works. But what does it mean to really work for us? Well, for us as computational biologists, it means that we can really turn sequence into three-dimensional structure. Specifically, we can turn, in our case, we can turn amino acid sequences into three-dimensional structure, three-dimensional protein structure. So, say we have a group of protein structures, like so, and we want to see if this sequence of amino acids forms something like it. How is this possible? Well, we know that this sequence forms this structure. How? Because the hard work was done by people in a wet lab. But we want to determine if this sequence is sufficiently similar to this sequence, whose structure we don't know. And if it's sufficiently similar, we can infer that it forms the same structure. So, for the code to really work, given a sequence, we can find a similar sequence. We do this in Haskell with our program called Murphy. So how do we know which sequences are similar? Well, sequence similarity of one sequence is given by the Viterbi equations for solving a hidden Markov model. This is the standard approach for biological sequence analysis. Now, this is sort of old news. It's easy to translate mathematical equations into Haskell. I'm going to walk you through the points of correspondence, focusing on one equation. Now, here we've got the left side of the equation. We've got an emission score for a hidden Markov model. We've got a minimum over a set. We've got a transition score from one state of the hidden Markov model to the next. And finally, a recursive state, a recursive call here. Now, I've pulled a bit of a fast one on you. The equations, mathematical equations, have a v prime, and our code has a v double prime. So what's going on? The answer is there are multiple recursions, just like computing a Fibonacci number. So how do we make it efficient? Well, what my colleagues do in computational biology with their C++ code is traditional dynamic programming, managing a dynamic programming table. Do we have to do that in a functional language? Well, this is old news, but thanks to higher order functions, we do not. So higher order functions really work. It's not news. This is the code again, but you'll notice it has v prime instead of v double prime, so it is faithful to the math. I'm going to show you that we can take the code that matches the math exactly, turn it into code we actually run, and do this by a sequence of semantics preserving transformations. So here we're just going to set v double prime to v prime, and then we're going to set it to this memoization of v prime. So rather than manually managing dynamic programming tables, we can use memoization on the recurrence relations. And the punchline is we didn't have to write any of this memoization stuff. Luke Palmer did all the hard work, and we pulled it off the package. So that's Act 1. Act 2 is that it mostly works. So why mostly? Well, laziness, I am having clicker issues today. Laziness enables modular search. What does it mean to really work? Well, one component, which you just saw, was the Viterbi algorithm. A second component to our approach is stochastic search. So our research problem involves searching through a space of protein structures that combinatorics makes exponential in size. So I gave you the Viterbi algorithm in equations and code. I'm going to talk about stochastic search in pictures and diagrams. So how does stochastic search work? Well, thanks to Warren Sarl at SAS, for about 18 years, statisticians have joked about explaining optimization problems using kangaroos to find the highest or lowest point. So we can plop a kangaroo in the Dutch peninsula and have it hop around randomly and hope it finds its way to the North Sea. So let's look at a diagram of a more abstract search, as suggested by John Hughes in 1984. So this is coded in a modular way. One function generates a list of candidates, and a second function examines a finite prefix. So the rest of the infinite list is not evaluated. This search corresponds to one in which every step makes progress, and the kangaroo always jumps uphill, or always downhill in our case. We are looking for the North Sea here. But our kangaroos are not that smart. Sometimes our kangaroo jumps uphill. So how do we deal with this? Well, our search algorithm is simple. When the kangaroo jumps downhill, we let it continue. And if it jumps uphill, we tell it bad kangaroo and send it back to try again. and hope it finds a better point. So drawing a picture of this kind of search kind of looks like this. Here, the kangaroo takes 4 bad steps before finally finding a good one. Then it takes 2 bad steps, but then its third is good, and so on. And this continues indefinitely. So the key question here is, how can we program this kind of search in a modular way? It would be ideal if we could simply filter out the bad jumps and have something like this. And notice this thing on the right. It looks different, but it's really isomorphic to this over here, or this before we took a prefix. So it's isomorphic to the kind of search John Hughes described. So ideally we use all the same kinds of tools, the same kind of selection function. The problem is this actually doesn't work. If we get an especially dumb kangaroo, or if the kangaroo gets trapped in a valley, all the jumps from that point are uphill. Yes, approaches like simulated annealing help, but there's still this fundamental problem. The picture looks kind of like this. So what happens, notice, we make one good jump, but then every jump from there is bad. What happens if we filter this? Well, the filter produces the first 2 points just fine, but when it tries to find the next point, instead it follows an infinite list of bad jumps. If the ultimate consumer needs more than 2 points, the whole search diverges. So our idea of a modular search won't really work. Instead, we have to fall back on a new kind of final consumer, and that has to be aware of this possibility of a stupid jump. So this isn't actually as bad as it sounds. We do have lots of modularity. We've coded 4 different kinds of stochastic search, and they share roughly half of their functions in common. You know, I'm not trying to say that we got no modularity. We just didn't get this classic John Hughes 1984 modularity. So for the coda, I do want to say that some obstacles remain. Now, the first obstacle that people often ask about is, well, didn't you have to re-implement a lot of stuff? I'm happy to report that re-implementation isn't really an obstacle. As it happens, many computational biologists start from scratch regardless, even when there are great libraries they can use. And it's true. And the other thing is that doing it in Haskell was fun. Now, I think everyone in the room knows why that's important, but my dissertation advisor asked, why is that important? The second obstacle is sometimes hackage. Now, I mentioned Luke Palmer's data.no combinators was excellent, but not everything in hackage is good. Our first implementation used a randomness monad, well, not really our first implementation. Our first implementation using a randomness monad, it turned out the randomness monad was strict, and this resulted in hanging the machine. We thank Karen Clausen for diagnosing this very quickly this summer. I'm also sorry to report that monads are still an obstacle. The IO and maybe monads are fine. We understand this. There are some great tutorials. The concept of launching the missiles makes sense. Where did we have the most trouble? I mentioned the randomness monad. We was strict, but we really needed it. Without using that, we were trying to pass along a list of random numbers. We ended up reusing random numbers and getting a really terrible stochastic search. And we had trouble melding pure code and monadic code. We had this beautiful pure code, and when we realized we needed to use a monad, figuring out how to introduce the randomness monad was not easy. Now, as some of you know, at an invited talk almost 10 years ago, Simon Peyton Jones suggested that we would have done better calling monads warm, fuzzy things. But I have to say that some of our difficulties suggest they may sometimes be warm, fuzzy things with fangs. Lastly, Andrew and I wanted to apply the debugging skills that we have honed through years of imperative programming. But these skills did not transfer well to Haskell. The breakpoint debugger just doesn't scale. What we know are breakpoints and printfs. You know the trouble with this. Next, we tried to use quick check, but we found it surprisingly hard to deploy. So why? Well, the real problem is instance declarations for arbitrary. Tutorials covered only using new functions on existing data types, how to write quick check properties. Initially, we found some properties that were violated, but we got lots of useless counterexamples that were too big to help. We had to shrink them, and shrinking has to preserve invariance. In our case, some of our data types have some weird constraints. And finally, we had a similar experience with arbitrary. It kept baffling us that there was nothing to apply it to. This dispatches on the result type. There's no arrow, no arguments, and we don't know if it was difficult because it was a monad or because it's overloaded on the result type. There's something that just felt alien here. Those who have taught functional programming may have noticed that students have an easier time learning polymorphic functions than bare polymorphic values. All right, so you've seen Acts 1 and 2 and the coda. Functional programming really works, mostly, and there are still some obstacles. I'd like to conclude by saying that there are a couple of things that you can tell your friends, and then there are a couple, especially if they're computational biologists, and then there are a couple of things I would really hope some people in the ICFP community will do. So, this was only the second Haskell program for myself and Andrew. written, and the first of any real size, over a couple hundred lines of code. And re-implementation is okay. You know, we computational biologists got this to work. Re-implementing was not a big deal, even though many of our colleagues' first fear is, oh, I'm going to have to start over and rewrite all this code. And if you write a new data type, write a new arbitrary instance immediately. Why? Because that's when the invariants are fresh in your mind, and so you have a good chance of actually getting the arbitrary instance right. In addition, it would really help to identify authoritative voices. There are a lot of people speaking with blogs and tutorials. There are people speaking with their code on Hackage. It's hard to know who to listen to or where to find the best information. That's something that individuals here can help with, but it would be really good if the ICFP as a whole could do something. Yesterday, Robbie told us all to work harder. Right now, the only thing ICFP does officially is to referee research papers. Maybe it's possible to do more, so I just ask you if there's maybe some way forward.